The bell at the Starlight Diner rarely rang at 3 a.m. Elara Vance looked up from the counter. A black sedan, a Lincoln Navigator, was parked outside. The man who entered, Mr. Graves, wore a suit more expensive than Elara's car. The air thickened. He placed a crocodile-leather briefcase on the counter. "Ms. Vance?" His voice was precise. Before she could nod, he pushed something across. Not money. A 1943 steel penny, tarnished. The same coin Mr. Aris, the old regular she served every night, always left. "Mr. Thorne has passed away," Graves said. "This briefcase contains his trust. He believed you were the only one who could see the truth. The truth would change everything." Elara Vance stared at the dull gray coin, her reflection warped in the stainless steel coffee machine behind the counter. "We wonder where you're watching from tonight, because maybe you've met someone just like her. Someone whose quiet integrity was about to be tested by forces they never expected." The steel penny felt heavy in her palm, heavier than a normal cent, carrying the impossible weight of the words Mr. Graves had just spoken. Mr. Thorne passed away. She hadn't even known his real last name. To her, he was only Mr. Aris, her 9:30 p.m. regular, punctual as the tides, always taking the corner booth by the jukebox that hadn't worked since the 1990s. Her mind flashed back just 24 hours to his last visit. Mr. Aris, bundled in a threadbare wool coat that always seemed too thin for the Providence winters, nursing his single cup of black coffee. He always ordered the same thing: coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie he rarely finished. He was a man of few words, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He would often watch the local news on the diner's small, buzzing television and mutter under his breath. He always muttered about the same thing. "Vultures in their ivory towers," he'd rumble, tapping a finger on the Formica table. "All spreadsheets, no soul. They build glass towers just to look down on the street. They count the dollars, but they forgot the cents, Elara. They forgot the steel." He always paid in cash, exact change, and always left this strange, specific coin as his tip. The first time he left the 1943 steel penny, Elara had tried to return it, thinking it was a mistake, a novelty item he'd dropped. He had gently, firmly pushed her hand away. "Keep it, dear Elara," he'd said, his voice a low, kind rasp. "It doesn't look like much, not like real money, but it was made when the world needed strength, not shine. It's made of what matters." She kept it, and the half-dozen others like it, in a small glass jar by her register. They were her collection of steel. Now, this polished stranger, Mr. Graves, was holding one. It felt like a violation of her quiet, predictable world. That world was the Starlight Diner, a 24-hour beacon of fluorescent light against the dark Rhode Island streets. The diner was her life, but it was not the one she had planned. At 26, Elara was drowning. The scent of stale coffee and industrial bleach was the backdrop to her crushing student loan debt, a constant reminder of a 4-year degree she hadn't been able to finish. Now she was chipping away at a different future, one night shift at a time. After her shift, from 4 a.m. until the sun rose, she sat at her tiny apartment table, hunched over a laptop, taking an online certificate program in forensic accounting and data analytics. She had a mind for numbers, a quiet, fierce talent for seeing the patterns in the chaos. It was her secret weapon, her only way out. "Mr. Eris," Mr. Graves clarified, his voice pulling her sharply from her memories, "was Eris Thorne, the founder and principal benefactor of the Thorne Community Trust." Ilara's stomach dropped. She knew that name. Everyone in Providence knew that name. It was etched onto hospital wings, university libraries, and homeless shelters. $1 billion foundation. The quiet man who ate stale pie in her diner managed that. Graves seemed to read her disbelief. He motioned with his chin toward the gleaming Lincoln Navigator outside, a vehicle that looked like it belonged in a different dimension than the gritty street. Mr. Thorne valued authenticity. He spent his final year observing. He was testing the world, and the world largely failed him. You, Ms. Vance, did not. Graves's gaze was intense, analytical, like a jeweler inspecting a stone. "Mr. Thorne believed you possessed the integrity his board of directors has tragically lost." Lost. It was such a polite, sterile word. Mr. Eris had called them vultures. Ilara looked at the crocodile briefcase. It seemed impossibly heavy, made of dark, oiled leather that probably cost more than her rent for an entire year. "What's in the briefcase?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the freezer. Mr. Graves did not smile. He undid the two polished gold latches. Click, click. The sound was offensively loud in the empty diner. He spun the briefcase to face her. It was not full of money. It was full of documents, stacks of them, bound neatly in blue legal covers. On top sat a single-page letter, embossed with a formal letterhead, addressed to Ms. Ilara Vance. He slid it out from a leather strap. "This," Graves said, "is a legal directive from Mr. Thorne's personal trust. A final instruction activated upon his death." Ilara took the paper. Her hand, rough from dishwater, trembled slightly. The legalese was thick, but the core of it was shockingly clear. He had named her Temporary Community Overseer. For 30 days, full and unrestricted access to all financial records, full authority to review everything. She was a waitress holding a steel penny, being asked to audit a $1 billion empire. "They won't allow this," she whispered, the thought of the vultures terrifying her. I'm not qualified." Mr. Thorne disagreed, Graves said flatly. He wasn't looking for another resume from the Ivy League. He was looking for a conscience. He said you were the only one qualified. "Because you never asked him for anything, even when he looked like he had nothing." He closed the briefcase, the latches snapping shut with finality. They won't have a choice. Mr. Thorne made sure of that. "Our first meeting is at 10 a.m., the Thorne Tower, 31st floor. I suggest you get some rest, Ms. Vance." Ilara never went home. Sleep was an impossible, distant luxury. She simply went into the diner's small, drafty back office, washed her face in the cold water of the utility sink, and rebuttoned her pale blue uniform jacket. It was the cleanest, most professional-looking thing she owned. At 9:50 a.m., Mr. Graves was waiting outside, just as he said he would be. The Lincoln Navigator was idling silently at the curb, a black, polished void against the bright, gritty morning. The ride was only 10 blocks, but it felt like crossing an ocean. The Starlight Diner was built of honest brick and worn-out formica. The Thorn Tower was a spear of glass and steel that seemed to disapprove of the very ground it sat on. Elara clutched the strap of her worn backpack, the one she used to carry her textbooks for her online classes. The lobby was a cathedral of Italian marble and whispered importance. Men and women in immaculate suits, smelling of expensive cologne and quiet authority, moved with a predatory speed. They paid Elara no attention. In her polyester uniform, she was invisible, just another part of the service staff, like a ghost haunting their world of commerce. Mr. Graves, however, commanded a silent respect. He didn't speak, just guided her with a small, precise gesture toward a private, wood-paneled elevator bank. The doors slid shut, sealing them in silence, and they ascended. The ride was perfectly smooth, silent, and sickeningly fast. Elara's ears popped as the doors opened on the 31st floor. The 31st floor was not an office. It was a skytop. The world was reduced to a map below them. A severe-looking receptionist at a desk carved from a single piece of stone directed them into a boardroom that overlooked the entire city of Providence. Two people were waiting at the far end of a mahogany table that seemed to stretch for a mile. A man, Julian Croft, stood by the window, adjusting the cuff of his shimmering Brioni suit. He was handsome, with a politician's smile that didn't touch his cold, assessing eyes. The woman, Ms. Davies, was the opposite. She was perfectly still, precise, and dressed in a dark, severe suit. She was the trust's legal counsel, and she watched Elara's approach with the impassive curiosity of a biologist studying an insect. Julian Croft turned from the window, his smile widening as his gaze swept over Elara's diner uniform and backpack. "Ah, Miss Vance." "Julian Croft," he said, offering a hand he knew she was too far away to shake. "This is unique." He let the word hang in the air, waited with condescension. Aris always did have a peculiar sense of humor, sending us a waitress in uniform, no less. It's almost poetic in its simplicity. Elara felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she locked her jaw and kept her expression neutral. She would not give him the satisfaction. She looked at Miss Davies, who just continued to watch, unblinking. Miss Davies finally spoke, her voice as crisp and cold as the glass walls around them. "We have reviewed the unconventional codicil to Mr. Thorne's trust, Ms. Vance. Legally, the position of community overseer is yours for the 30-day term." Croft stepped in smoothly, taking over, his tone suddenly magnanimous. "And we, the board, are prepared to honor Aris's eccentric final wish. In fact, we've allocated a compensation package for your time, $50,000. He smiled, a flash of perfectly white teeth. "It's a significant sum. All it requires is your signature on a standard non-disclosure agreement, and of course, your cooperation in not disrupting the sensitive, day-to-day operations of the trust. Elara looked from Croft's beaming face to Davy's neutral mask. $50,000. The words echoed in her head. It was more money than she had ever imagined holding. It was a lifeline. It would wipe out her student loan debt, pay her rent for years, and get her out of the diner forever. It was an escape pod, handed to her on a silver platter, and all she had to do was sign a paper, take the money, and walk away. But then she thought of Mr. Harris, alone in his booth, muttering about vultures and steel. This wasn't compensation. This was a bribe. This was the first test. Ms. Davies, anticipating agreement, slid a single document across the polished mahogany. The NDA. Elara, ignoring Croft, picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen. She read the document. Her eyes, trained by her late-night studies, scanned the dense legal text. It was a standard confidentiality agreement. It restricted her from speaking about what she found, but it didn't restrict her from looking. She signed her name, Elara Vance, with a steady hand. "I'll sign the NDA," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly strong in the vast, silent room. "Confidentiality is important." She pushed the paper back to Davies. "But I will not be accepting the $50,000. Not at this time. I will accept payment after I have fulfilled the duties of the position as Mr. Thorne intended." The change in the room was immediate. Julian Croft's patronizing smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance. "What duties? Ms. Vance, it's a symbolic title, a gesture." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You can't possibly think you're going to... what? Audit us?" Elara ignored him, her gaze fixed on the only person in the room who mattered. The lawyer. "The directive," Elara stated, quoting the letter from memory, "stipulates full and unrestricted access to all financial records. I would like that access now." Croft sputtered. "This is preposterous. She's a—" "Mr. Croft," Ms. Davies interjected, her voice cutting him off like a razor. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed her face. She was angry, Elara realized, not at Elara, but at Croft for losing control of the situation. She is technically correct. The codicil is ironclad. Mr. Thorne's personal counsel drafted it. She has the right to access. The dramatic irony was palpable. They had expected a gullible girl, and instead, they had a legal problem. Davies was already calculating, readjusting. She pulled a new white security card from a desk drawer and slid it across the table. It stopped inches from Elara's hand. "You will be given a temporary login and an office. Welcome to the Thorne Trust, Ms. Vance." Elara's office was not an office. It was a windowless supply closet on a lower floor, tucked behind the humming elevator service core. The air was stale, smelling faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and old toner cartridges. A single, cheap desk and a discarded ergonomic chair had been shoved into the corner, an obvious and insulting afterthought. They had given her a room with no view, a place to be forgotten. expecting her to sit quietly and count down her 30 days. But the room had two things they overlooked: a power outlet and an active data port. For Alara, it was all she needed. She sat down, plugged in her own laptop, and connected the Thorn-issued terminal. She took a deep, steadying breath, closed her eyes, and let the insults of the boardroom fade. This was not their world. This was hers. She logged into the Thorn Trust's financial mainframe. The screen flickered to life, presenting a daunting wall of data, a fortress of numbers designed to intimidate and confuse. But to Alara, this was not chaos. This was a language. Her late nights spent studying forensic accounting had been a drill for this exact moment. She wasn't just a waitress. She was an analyst, trained to see the narrative hidden in the decimals. She knew instinctively, as Mr. Aris had known, that the real story would not be in the multi-million-dollar grants to hospitals or universities. Those were the public-facing, heavily audited transactions. The real rot, if it existed, would be hidden in the mundane, the boring, the thousands of small transactions that no one important ever bothered to check. Alara ignored the major philanthropy tab. She ignored the endowment portfolio. She clicked on operational expenses. The file was massive, a digital dumping ground for the cost of keeping the lights on. She began to filter, sorting by vendor and payment frequency. Most of it was routine: utilities, rent, payroll. But then a name popped up, again and again: Ethel Consulting. The payments were for strategic services, a term so vague it was practically meaningless, and the sums were staggering. Tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, paid out monthly. Ethel Consulting was, on paper, one of the Trust's most expensive strategic partners. Alara flagged it. This was plant number 3. She moved on, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her data analytics training taking over. She pulled the vendor files for the Trust's major annual event, the Thorn Charity Gala. It was the jewel of the Providence social calendar, raising millions. The main file was clean. But when she cross-referenced the subcontractor invoices, a new pattern emerged. One vendor, Apex Event Group. Apex handled the venue. Apex handled the catering. Apex handled the floral arrangements and the audio visuals. The costs were astronomical, easily triple the industry standard for an event of that size. It was a blatant, audacious overbilling, all consolidated under a single, convenient provider. Alara tagged plant number 4. Finally, she navigated to the smallest, newest program in the Trust's portfolio: the Community Micro Grants. This was the program Croft had bragged about in the lobby's digital display. His innovation to help grassroots causes. It looked perfect. A long list of small grants. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, distributed to dozens of small nonprofits. It was the definition of good works. But Alara's instincts, honed by Mr. Aris's cynicism about ivory towers, told her to look closer. She picked 5 recipient names at random and plugged them into the state's public business registry database on her personal laptop. The results sent a chill down her spine. The 5 nonprofits were not grassroots organizations. They were all limited liability companies, all filed within the same week, just 6 months prior. None had a functional website. None had a listed phone number. Just a registered agent. She had seen this pattern in her case studies. These weren't charities. They were ghosts. They were shells, created for the sole purpose of receiving money. She now had 3 distinct threads, 3 different methods of siphoning money, all hidden in plain sight. Elara opened a new encrypted spreadsheet on her laptop, a file entirely separate from the Thorn network. She began to type, creating a map. The vultures, she thought, were sloppy. They had gotten too comfortable, too used to no one ever checking the receipts. For the next 4 days, Elara Vance lived a strange double life. By night, she worked her shifts at the Starlight Diner, the familiar rhythm of wiping counters and pouring coffee a comforting, solid anchor in a world that had tilted off its axis. By day, she returned to her windowless closet, the temporary overseer in her diner uniform, conducting one of the most significant forensic investigations in the state's history. She slept in 3-hour increments, her mind fueled by caffeine and a cold, clarifying anger. Mr. Aris had called them vultures, and Elara was now building a cage for them, one data point at a time. She began by taking her 3 primary threads, Ethel Consulting, Apex Event Group, and the Microgrant LLCs, and pulling them out of the Thorn network. She used her own laptop and the diner's public Wi-Fi during her breaks, accessing the Rhode Island Secretary of State's public business database. She was no longer just an analyst. She was a hunter. The work was methodical, precise, and deeply satisfying. This was the forensic part of her online degree, brought to life. She opened a new blank Excel spreadsheet, titling it Providence Audit Internal. It was a simple, powerful tool, and she began to populate it, cell by cell. First, she typed in Ethel Consulting. The database confirmed its existence. Registered agent, a generic legal service in downtown Providence. But the principal address, the one required by law for business filings, was not a glittering office tower. It was a P.O. box, a UPS store on the outskirts of Cranston. Elara felt a small, grim smile touch her lips. This was classic textbook evasion. She carefully copied the box number into her spreadsheet. Then she typed in Apex Event Group, a different registered agent, a different filing date. But the principal address, her breath caught. It was the exact same UPS store, the exact same P.O. box number. This was the first critical link. She sat back, the hum of the service elevator outside her door fading into the background. It was a sloppy mistake, born of pure arrogance. They had used the same drop box for both multi-million-dollar shell corporations. Now, she had to find the human connection. A P.O. box was a dead end, but the incorporator, the person who filed the papers, was public record. For Ethel Consulting, the principal officer was listed as Thomas J. Riley. For Apex Event Group, the principal was Sarah G. Kincaid. The names meant nothing to her. They were likely just names, paid to sign a document. Elara knew better. A good lawyer, a careful lawyer, would use someone they could trust, someone whose loyalty was guaranteed. She opened a new browser tab, this one for public access social media profiles. She searched for Sarah G. Kincaid, Rhode Island. The profile was private, but the profile picture showed a woman who looked uncannily like Ms. Davies. Elara dug deeper, looking at public comments and tagged photos. And there, on a public congratulations post from a local university, she found the connection. Sarah G. Kincaid had commented, "So proud of my brilliant cousin, and you deserve it all." The cousin was Ann Davies. Her heart was hammering now. This was it. One down. She turned her attention to Thomas J. Riley. The name was more common. She tried a different approach. She searched Thomas J. Riley and Ann Davies together. The search results were sparse until she added a new term, law. The result popped up instantly. A donor list for the Roger Williams University School of Law Alumni Association, dated 5 years prior. 2 names were listed side by side as co-chairs of the Class of 2005 Reunion Committee. Thomas J. Riley and Ann Davies, her classmate and her cousin. Elara's hands were perfectly steady as she added these names to her spreadsheet. The entire conspiracy was now laid bare, a neat, logical, and utterly damning diagram. Ms. Davies, the quiet, precise, untouchable legal counsel, was the architect. She had built the machine. She used her family and her old school friend to create the companies, giving them legal distance while maintaining absolute control. Julian Croft, the arrogant CEO, wasn't the mastermind. He was the muscle. He was the one inside the trust with the authority to sign the checks, to approve the fraudulent invoices from Ethel and Apex. He was the public-facing peacock, while Davies was the silent spider, weaving the web that moved millions. And the micro-grants? That was the most brilliant, cynical part of the entire scheme. Elara spent the next hour cross-referencing the LLCs for those grassroots organizations. The pattern held. The incorporators were all different people, but their last names cross-reference perfectly with the other members of the Thorn Trust Board of Directors. The micro-grants weren't charity. They were loyalty payments. It was the money Davies and Croft used to buy the silence and complicity of the entire board, ensuring no one would ever ask the hard questions. They had turned Eris Thorne's legacy of community trust into their own private slush fund. Elara finally leaned back, the spreadsheet complete. It was a map of their greed, and it was the key to their destruction. Elara requested the meeting for 4 p.m. on a Thursday. She was specific. Only Mr. Croft and Ms. Davies. No one else. They met in the same vast boardroom, the scene of her initial humiliation. But the power dynamic had fundamentally, irreversibly shifted. Elara was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table when they entered, a spot usually reserved for the chairman. She was not wearing her diner uniform. She was wearing a simple, clean black blouse and dark pants, her hair pulled back. She looked not like a waitress, but like what she was, a forensic auditor. Her laptop was already open, plugged into the room's massive central monitor. Julian Croft entered first, radiating annoyance. He clearly saw this as a waste of his valuable time, another eccentricity from the waitress. "Ms. Vance, I do hope this is productive. I have a fundraising dinner, and I am extremely busy." Ms. Davies followed, her expression as impassive as ever, though she noted Ilara's position at the table with a flicker of analytical interest. She took her usual seat, opened a leather-bound portfolio, and placed a pen precisely beside it. She was prepared to take notes on Ilara's foolishness. Ilara said nothing. She simply pressed a key on her laptop. The 80-inch monitor behind her flickered to life, displaying not a presentation, but a simple, stark, and utterly damning Excel spreadsheet. "Thank you for meeting me," Ilara said, her voice calm and even, echoing slightly in the opulent room. "I have, as requested by the terms of Mr. Thorne's trust, completed my initial review of the operational expenditures." She used her mouse, and a red-bordered cell lit up on the screen. Ethel Consulting paid $8.1 million over the last 24 months for strategic services. It is registered to this P.O. box in Cranston. She clicked. A new cell lit up. Apex Event Group paid $4.2 million in gala overages. It is registered to the exact same P.O. box. The room was absolutely silent, save for the click of her mouse. Croft's self-satisfied smirk faltered. He looked confused, then annoyed. "What is this? Are you suggesting our vendors share a mail service? This is your grand discovery?" Ilara ignored him, her mouse moving again. "I've cross-referenced the incorporators. Ethel Consulting was filed by a Mr. Thomas J. Riley. Apex Event Group by a Ms. Sarah G. Kincaid." She looked up from her screen, not at Croft, but directly at Ann Davies. "Thomas J. Riley was, according to university records, your classmate and reunion co-chair at Roger Williams Law. Sarah G. Kincaid is, according to public social media, your cousin." The blood drained from Ann Davies's face. It was the first genuine, uncontrolled human emotion Ilara had ever seen from her. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her hand, which had been resting calmly on her portfolio, gripped the leather so hard her knuckles turned white. She was frozen. Julian Croft, finally sensing the trap, exploded. "This is outrageous! You are accusing! This is libel! You signed a non-disclosure agreement! I will have you in court by tomorrow! I will sue you for everything you have!" He stopped, catching himself, but his face was purple with rage. He had walked straight into a legal bear trap, and he was just now realizing it. Ilara waited patiently for his tirade to finish. When he was panting, breathless with his own fury, she finally spoke again, her voice cutting through his anger like ice. "You are mistaken, Mr. Croft. I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am presenting a spreadsheet that shows public data. I have not violated any NDA, as this is an internal review requested by the Trust's founder. You are the ones who will be speaking with lawyers." She turned her gaze back to Ms. Davies, the true opponent. "You have two options. Option 1, I take this spreadsheet and the subsequent 40 pages of documentation linking the micro-grants to the rest of the board, and I walk it over to the office of the State Attorney General. The Providence Journal We'll have it by 6 p.m. She let that hang in the air. Davy's eyes, wide with panic, finally met hers. Option 2, Elara continued, is a private resolution. At 9 a.m. tomorrow, I receive signed, irrevocable letters of resignation from both of you, effective immediately. You will also sign a legally binding confession and a repayment agreement, transferring $8.1 million back to the Trust's general fund from your personal accounts. Finally, you will both sign a covenant agreeing never to work in the nonprofit sector in any state ever again. If you do this, my report to the new board will state only that I found severe administrative irregularities, which you have taken full financial responsibility for, and that the matter is closed. Elara stood up and began to pack her laptop into her worn backpack. The spreadsheet vanished from the screen, plunging the room back into its normal, opulent twilight. You have 24 hours to decide. If I do not have those signed documents in my hand by 9 a.m., I go with option 1. The choice is yours. She zipped her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the two of them alone in the suffocating, guilty silence. It was 9 a.m. Elara stood in the boardroom, not at the head of the table, but to the side by the large monitor. She had her backpack and her laptop, and she was waiting. The ultimatum had expired. At 9:01, the main doors opened, but it wasn't just Croft and Davies. It was the entire board of directors, a collection of 7 of the city's most powerful figures, filing in with somber, judgmental expressions. Croft and Davies entered last. They did not look defeated. They looked righteous. Davies was holding a new file, and Croft wore the expression of a man deeply wronged. He had not come to surrender. He had come to fight. He had called an emergency board meeting, and Elara was the agenda. Ms. Vance, Croft began, his voice booming with false magnanimity. We are glad you are here. We have called an emergency session of the board to discuss your activities. He paced in front of the window, a silhouette against the morning sun. Yesterday, Ms. Vance, a new temporary employee operating under a title of overseer, attempted to blackmail this institution's CEO and its general counsel. He let the word hang in the air. Blackmail. The other board members, the ones whose LLCs Elara had identified, gasped in performative shock. She presented a fantasy, Croft continued, his voice rising. A conspiracy theory woven from public data she clearly does not understand. She has slandered our trusted partners and, frankly, has attempted to extort us. This was their counterattack. It was brilliant in its own way. They were using their power, their credibility, and her lack of it to crush her. With all due respect, Julian, a board member piped up. How could this happen? Croft pointed directly at Elara, a gesture of pure, theatrical accusation. This is what happens, he spat, when you invite someone with no qualifications into a position of trust. She is a waitress. There it was. The payoff from his first insult. She is not an auditor. She is not a lawyer. She is a civilian who misinterpreted public records and violated her non-disclosure agreement in an attempt to get a payout. Davies, silent until now, nodded grimly. Her actions constitute gross misconduct and potential criminal libel. I am recommending the board vote to terminate her position immediately and pursue all legal remedies. The room was a sea of hostile faces, all aimed at Elara. The other board members, eager to cover their own tracks, were nodding in agreement. All in favor of the motion, Croft began. Elara held up her hand. "Excuse me." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the self-congratulatory venom. "I have not violated my NDA. I have not presented my findings to anyone outside this room. I am not interpreting data. I am collating it." She looked at the board members one by one. "I am stating as a fact that Ethel Consulting, which you paid $8 million to, is registered to a P.O. box. I am stating as a fact that its principal is Ms. Davies' former classmate. I am stating as a fact that your own micro-grant recipients are shell companies registered to your family members." The room erupted. "Insolence! How dare she?" But before Croft could bang his metaphorical gavel, the main boardroom doors slid open again. It was Mr. Graves. He looked calm, his expensive suit perfectly pressed. He was holding the crocodile-leather briefcase. "My apologies, Mr. Croft, ladies and gentlemen, for the interruption," Graves said, his voice precise. "I am late. I was retrieving supplemental materials for this very meeting. Materials Mr. Thorne prepared." This simple statement silenced the room. Graves walked directly to the head of the table, placing the briefcase in the empty chairman's seat. Click, click. He opened the latches, the sound echoing the night at the diner. This was the payoff. The briefcase. Elara's heart was pounding. She finally understood. The briefcase hadn't just held the will, it held the weapon. Mr. Thorne, in the months prior to his passing, became concerned, Graves explained, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the board. He, too, noticed the irregularities. And so he did what a prudent man of his resources would do. He commissioned a full, independent, forensic audit. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a document, 5 inches thick, bound in dark blue. "This," he said, "is the final report from Deloitte and Touche, finalized 2 weeks ago. I was instructed by Mr. Thorne to release it only if his chosen overseer's review was met with resistance. It was an evidence cascade." Graves didn't need to read the whole report. He simply turned to the executive summary. "The audit confirms a sophisticated multi-year conspiracy to defraud the Thorne Trust. It names Ethel Consulting and Apex Event Group as primary shell corporations, registered to," he looked directly at Ann Davies, "Thomas J. Riley and Sarah G. Kincaid. It details the flow of funds from these entities into offshore accounts. It also lists the micro-grant LLCs." He looked around the table at the other board members. "As a mechanism for co-conspirator payments." The color drained from every face. The public verdict had been rendered, not by Elara, but by Aris Thorne himself, from beyond the grave. Croft, speechless, collapsed into his chair. Ms. Davies, the architect, simply closed her portfolio, a final, quiet admission of defeat. The trap, made of steel and numbers, had snapped shut. The boardroom, which seconds before had been a battlefield of accusations, was now a tomb. The only sound was Mr. Graves quietly repacking the Deloitte audit into his crocodile briefcase. Julian Croft was staring at the blank monitor, his face a mask of gray disbelief. Anne Davies, the architect of it all, was methodically shredding a single piece of paper from her notepad, her expression completely vacant. The other board members, the ones implicated by the micro-grant scheme, looked at each other, their alliance shattered, each one silently calculating their own exit strategy. Graves did not need to say another word. He simply pulled out his phone, pressed a single preset number, and said, "We are ready." Within 3 minutes, the elevator doors opened again. But this was not another executive. 2 uniformed Providence police officers and a man in a detective's suit entered. They moved with a quiet, professional purpose. The detective spoke, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Croft? Ms. Davies? We'd like you to come with us to answer some questions regarding an investigation into financial mismanagement at the Thorn Trust." There were no handcuffs, not yet. It was all very polite, very civilized, and utterly final. As they were escorted out, Croft, in a last pathetic grasp for his old authority, sputtered, "This is a misunderstanding." But no one, not even the officers, was listening. The other board members were informed by Mr. Graves that they would be tendering their resignations and cooperating fully with the asset recovery process, or they would be the next ones the detective spoke to. The story broke the next morning, exploding across the front page of the Providence Journal. The headline was stark, a perfect summary of the entire affair. Diner waitress uncovers multi-million-dollar corruption at Thorn Trust. Ilara's life was changed in an instant. The diner was swarmed by news vans. Her face was on every local channel. She was no longer invisible. She was a folk hero, the waitress auditor, a symbol of integrity who had taken down the city's untouchable elite. The public imagination was captured by the stark, moral contrast. The humble waitress in her blue uniform, armed only with a laptop and a conscience, facing down the men and women in their $1,000 suits. A new emergency board was convened, consisting of retired judges and community leaders Mr. Graves had clearly kept on standby, another part of Eris Thorne's meticulous planning. They met with Ilara a week later in the same boardroom. The atmosphere, however, was one of deep, profound respect. "Ms. Vance," the new chairwoman, a former judge, said, "Your 30-day term is technically over. However, on behalf of the restored trust, we would like to offer you a permanent position." She slid a contract across the table. "Director of Community Integrity and Oversight. It comes with a salary of $200,000 a year and a permanent voting seat on this board." Ilara looked at the contract. It was more than an escape. It was a new life. It was a validation of her late-night studies, of her integrity, of Mr. Eris's strange, profound faith in her. She accepted. Her first act, at her first official board meeting, was to make a motion. "Mr. Croft and Ms. Davies," she explained, "have returned, via asset seizure, the $8.1 million they stole." She looked around the table. I propose we do not put this money back into the general endowment. I propose we create a new, separate fund. She took a breath, the image of Mr. Harris's steel penny clear in her mind. We will call it the Steel Initiative. Its mission will be to provide immediate, direct emergency financial aid for medical bills, housing, and transportation to the service and night shift workers of Rhode Island. The people Mr. Harris watched every single night, the ones no one else sees. The motion passed unanimously. 6 months passed. The Starlight Diner was still the Starlight Diner, but the lights no longer flickered. The cracked vinyl on the booths had been replaced. The old jukebox was silent, but the air still smelled of strong coffee and griddled onions. It was 9:30 p.m. Elara Vance sat in the corner booth, the one that had belonged to Mr. Harris. The diner was warmer now. Its ancient heating system had been the first thing the Steel Initiative had paid to replace. Elara wasn't wearing her blue uniform. She was in a simple blazer, her laptop open in front of her. She was no longer serving coffee. She was reviewing grant applications, her screen filled with the stories of other night shift workers, other Elaras who needed a new transmission, a dental surgery, or a deposit for a safe apartment. A new waitress, a young woman around 20, approached her table. She looked tired, the same bone-weary exhaustion Elara knew better than her own name. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" the waitress asked, pulling a pen from her apron. Elara looked up from her screen, not with the gaze of a customer, but with the quiet empathy of a survivor. "Yes, please," Elara said, her voice kind. "I'll have a cup of black coffee and a slice of the apple pie." The order, Mr. Harris's order, felt like a small, private prayer. The waitress nodded, scribbled it down, and hurried off, oblivious to the history of the woman in the corner booth. Elara worked for an hour, approving a grant for a security guard needing new tires for his car, and another for a nurse's aide struggling with a medical copay. When the young waitress returned with the check, Elara smiled and slid her credit card into the folder. When the waitress brought it back, Elara signed the slip, adding a tip that was worth more than the entire check. "Thank you for the great service," Elara said. The waitress smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a good night." She turned to walk away, but Elara spoke again. "Oh, and this," Elara said, "is for you." She placed her hand on the Formica table and opened it. In her palm, next to the generous tip, sat a single, dull, 1943 steel penny. The young waitress paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. She looked at the strange gray coin. I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, hesitant to offend a good tipper. "But this isn't money. This is just, I don't think I can accept this." She thought it was a mistake, a piece of old metal. Elara looked at the coin, the symbolic object that had started everything. She looked at the young woman, who was her past. "You're right," Elara said softly, her voice full of a warmth that filled the booth. "It's not money. It's a reminder that real value, it isn't always in the things that shine. It's in the things that are made of steel, the things that are built to last, that have a core." She gently pushed the coin across the table. "Keep it For when you feel like the world is only counting the dollars and forgetting the cents. The waitress picked up the coin, her expression changing from confusion to a dawning, unspoken understanding. She closed her hand around it and nodded, her eyes shining. At that moment, the bell on the diner door chimed. The Lincoln Navigator, no longer an intimidating specter but a familiar comfort, pulled up to the curb. Mr. Graves stepped inside, his eyes finding Alara in the corner booth. He was no longer a mysterious messenger. He was her colleague, her chief of staff at the trust. He nodded toward her. "Ready for the board meeting, Director Vance?" Alara closed her laptop, the glow of the screen fading. She slid out of the booth, leaving the quiet diner, her old life, behind. She was no longer a waitress. She was an overseer, but she would never, ever forget what it meant to serve. The world is full of people who count the value of everything, but know the value of nothing. Sometimes it takes a person with nothing to lose to remind us what is truly priceless. And sometimes the smallest act of integrity, like simply seeing an old man in a diner, can open doors and topple empires that all the power in the world never could.